Hello friends, this is Growl. Today I'm going to be going over a 23 workshop that we did the other day. After pugging a few keys, I found that workshop might be the most, or rather the least understood dungeon in pugs, even at pretty high level. I was surprised at the knowledge gap that teams running 21 keys didn't have that we knew, so I wanted to make this video to share some of the intricacies. I'm going to probably pause some parts and fast forward others, just because there are some mechanics that needed to be explained and others that aren't that important. So the way the hammers work is, for each person under the hammer or mob, the hammer activates another time. So the strategy for dealing with these hammers is you have as many people stacking under it at the same time to activate it many times. So what we do here is we grab all the mobs together and all of us stand under it. That way the hammer is activating 7 or 8 times and it'll kill the mobs instantly. This is very important for dealing with the car. In pugs, you'll might not have a team that's organized enough to do this, so you may have to deal with healing the car more, but in an organized group, the car should be dying pretty quickly with this strategy. As a healer, you have to find some mix, because you don't want to be standing right next to the car because you need a ramp, but you want to be in as much as possible when you're not healing so that you get this extra damage. So the strategy that we use is we have the tank grab the other one and everyone stacks on the car to get the bonus hammers while the tank runs around with the other one. You can use wild charge there to disengage the foe flipper. That way you can stay grounded to get hots up. So before the vent jets, my general strategy is to put rejuve on everybody, life bloom on myself. I should have an F-low down. Then my first cast is wild growth, and then I'm using regrowths and swift mend if someone's in an emergency. In a less organized group, you may want to not trank on the first vent jets, because you'll have to deal with multiple vent jets if the team isn't good at dealing with the car. However, in this group, we're organized enough that I was fairly confident that we would be able to kill the car in just one vent jets. But when you're playing in pugs, you may have to plan out healing multiple of them. Usually my strategy is save trank for the second one, ask my team to use defensives and immunities for the first one, and then if we get to a third one, just using anything that you have or health potions just to stay alive. Sometimes defensives are back up again. So the reason that we don't bring the Pummeler into the hammer is because the Pummeler breaks the hammer when it goes under it. So you want to keep at least one hammer alive for the Pummeler to kill the car with. Our strategy, we choose to keep 2 alive. That way we can stack everyone together in that extra Pummeler hit too. I think it saves a little bit of time, but isn't super important. You can see in this key I'm running infinite stars. I don't really have a verdict or a specific reason why, I just sort of wanted to try it, so I'll let you guys know if this is something that I think everyone should run, but for the most part, my tests say that it's pretty good. It's better damage than I thought, but not that good. Probably not as good as a Twisted Appendage. So the next pack is the 2 little cars. These mobs are quite dangerous because they have a frontal that does a ton of damage, and they tend to shift around. They have a weird collision where they get stuck on top of each other and then fall off of each other, and that causes the frontal to get moved around in random places. So a strategy that I like to use is just focusing mainly on healing the tank. You can see I bark him there, Cenarion Ward, and most hots on him. That way he can tank the process waste a little bit better, and he can worry less about himself and help the team, so that the frontals are more likely to be pointed away. Then once the frontals are over, that's when I get into cat form and get all my dots applied again. You have to be careful here about using too much. I try to use Iron Bark on pull there so that it's up during the Fear Ad as well. The Fear Ad can be a little tough for the tanks here because there's very little room to move around. So this can be one of the more dangerous ones, both for the tank and for your teammates if they end up cleaving each other with the Fear Circle. One trick you can do there is wait outside the realm and go in after the first fear. That way you can ensure that it isn't going to be you and the tank that gets feared. But In a 23, I decided it wasn't super important. I'd rather just optimize for time. And then there you can see my bark comes up and I use it. I'm tracking the stacks of the bite. I see that there's 5 or 6 that get refreshed, so that's when I decide to use my bark. I try and be conscious about where I'm standing on this ad. I try and stand far away so that I'm out of the way of my DPS players, so that if something goes wrong, we don't cleave each other. Can probably skip a little bit of this. It's too far. Okay, so the next boss is Cujo. Cujo's mechanics are relatively straightforward, but there's a lot you can do to optimize your time here. So not all people know that you can actually hit Cujo behind the box. You can tell when you're safe. You get a buff called hiding behind junk. You can see I use a big weak aura to track it in the middle of my screen, but you don't need a weak aura. You can just look at your active buffs to see when you have this, and you sort of shimmy around the side of the box until you have both line of sight on the boss and you have the buff. A lot of it comes down to where the tank positions. You can see the tank positions the boss right on that corner. That way, even the melee can get line of sight on the boss. In a pug group, it may not be as organized, and you may be not able to get the spot if your tank doesn't know exactly how to position it. This explosive leap, especially on Tyrannical, hurts really bad, so I choose to pre-bear form every single one. Here we get the spot again, and it will end up saving a ton of time if you can consistently get this. The only time when I don't use this is during quaking. During quaking, I just stand far away so that my teammates don't have to move without worrying about all of us dying to quaking. Other than that, this is a pretty straightforward fight. You can see I'm just bear forming all of the explosive leaps, even though we can feign them or whatever just for safety. Just have to be very careful of the box that you need to use to hide and not blow it up. I think for the most part, there's not much more to go over on this fight. So we choose to do Cujo first for cooldown reasons. We lust Cujo because we can kill the first boss with the hammers anyway. Next is this stuff. I pull threat on this dog right here, trying to heal. So the first thing I do is bear form and bark skin and then run towards the tank. This is something that you should always try and do as a healer. It'll happen occasionally that you pull threat on mobs because your tank is focused on grouping all the mobs together efficiently, and they might not be able to hit every single one right away. So whenever you get threat, you want to make sure that you don't panic and run away. You want to run towards the tank. So this is a pull where it can get a little dangerous because you have the mob with the frontal as well as the wastes that blow up. Here I realize that there's going to be a big bursting stack and I just start ramping for it. However, all of my team has immunities for the most part, so I'm really only worried about myself. You'll find that the case in a lot of situations for bursting is that your main priority should only be the tank and yourself. If a DPS die, then it's not the end of the world. I didn't realize that those wastes were going to die so fast. I wasn't in a good position there. Part of the reason why I'm so pushed up is that this area where all these mobs are standing can be a line of sight spot because it's a hill. So it can be really tough to heal the tank while he's tanking over there and then line of sighting at the same time, but I'm sure I could have done a better job there. I think for the most part we can skip ahead of this part. We're just running here. So here is the 3-part gauntlet, if you will. The first pack is mostly tank damage and a few casters. This is a pack that's very important for having the weak aura that tracks who the targeted spells are on. I can see at all times where the spells are going to go, and although my team is going to be kicking most of them, it's still a good idea to notice. You may see that, okay, Tettles has 2 on him, so I'm ready to heal him there. And then you can see I saw there's 2 more on him, so I use the Swift Mend. Even though he's at 80% health, I want to make sure he's top so that he can live both of those hits. This is something that comes up from time to time in dungeons where you have a lot of caster mobs to the point where your team isn't able to interrupt them all. And especially when you're dealing with pug groups who are just going to miss interrupts in general because they're less coordinated. So the next pack is the heavy AoE damage pack. You want to focus all damage on the defense spot 3 because this is the one that does the big AoE that you only want to get one of. I make a little mistake there and I trank those wastes, so I don't have trank up for this pack. So the most important thing to do here is the dots that it puts out are really, really strong. So you want to make sure that you dispel them immediately. Especially you want to dispel 2 before the first short out. You can see I dispelled that one right away. Then you can sort of look and see who you want to dispel. Here I see that Psycho has Blur up. He's a Demon Hunter and he's also has Nether available. So I choose to dispel Tuttles. So since I don't have my Trank, I'm just trying to keep Rejuve on as many people as I can that are in danger. Wizrat is combusting, so I don't need to do much healing when he was in Lucid. On a Tyrannical key, this pack isn't too dangerous, but this may be pretty scary on Fortified. The biggest damage sources or people that are in danger are the people with this defense spot debuff, so I'm mainly prioritizing healing on them. The tank shouldn't need really any healing in this fight because they don't get the debuff. This guy does almost nothing. We can probably skip ahead here. Next is the Fear Ad. This area can be really scary, not because it's hard, but because it's really hard to see. So it's good to be on the same page as your tank to know what's going on here. Some tanks like to run with this guy right away, and others want to fight it here for a bit. So here we said, okay, we're going to fight this guy here for a little bit before we move. And then once we decided, okay, now it's time to move, now you run through this area. You can see how while you're running through that area, your camera gets really messed up. And it can be hard. If you run through that area, it's hard to know what exactly is going on. So it's good to have communication with your team. We're absolutely destroying this thing, so. Now on to this boss. This boss is a boss where it does almost no damage. That's unavoidable. However, the damage that it does is not only hard to avoid, but pretty lethal. So it's a good idea that you do your best to keep people topped, but at the same time, you want to be doing as much damage because the longer this fight goes on, the harder it gets. I usually end up making it a point to try and stay far away from the boss during the flame cannons, just to buy a little bit of space in case we have too many people around the same area. That way it's easier for everyone to see and dodge, but it doesn't make that big of a deal. We don't have Bloodlust for this pack because it's only a 23. This is a little lower than we normally do, so we're also playing with a pretty high damage comp because we don't have a rogue. So you can see here, even though there's not a lot of damage that's going to go out, I still want to make sure everyone's topped. Another small thing I do there is you can actually stand right in front of the flame cannon when it comes out because it's going to turn before it goes out. So if you're not sure which way it's going to go, you can actually just stand right in front of it and it's always going to be a safe spot. It may look scary, but... So this spot right here, at this exit is actually a safe spot only from the saws. So if you ever need a trank, for instance, I trank there just to fill up my well and do a little bit of healing. But if you ever need a trank, or if you're just needing to do a lot of healing, you can stand in that spot and not have to worry about the saws for a little bit. But the problem is there are other mechanics that you have to worry about, like the flame cannons and the blossom plants. You can see I do the same strategy again with standing in front of the fire, because at this point I don't remember which way it's turning. Other than that, this fight is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of secret to it. It's just a matter of dodging all the cogs and staying alive as I run into a cog. As a healer, it's really, really important to stay alive on this boss. This is one of those bosses where you can usually expect to expend a B-res or two. So you always want to be the healer that stays alive and is able to res. because not only is it real bad when you die, but it's very, very difficult for your teammates to res you, even if they have engineering. So, for instance, we have a, like, okay, well, I didn't, all right, I didn't remember what happened in this run, but our tank died to something, and then I got threat, and then I died. But luckily, we have a lot of battle reses. Make sure that when you take a battle res on this fight, and you will because you die in this fight a lot, you watch where the battle res is. You don't want to res and then die right away. You can see the little beam of light on the ground where your res is. So as tilting as it can be when you die, you just have to make sure you don't throw the key. Situations like this are always easily salvageable. We have 14 minutes left, so as long as we don't wipe, it's fine, even with 2 or 3 people. I can't tell you how many times I've gone through this boss with only 2 or 3 people. From my experience, I don't know this for sure, but it seems like the vent jets are actually fortified. They count as a minion. So on a fortified key, they're a lot harder to deal with. That might not be correct. That's just my experience. So you can see I was able to heal through it on our hunter. Generally, it's a good idea to track that debuff, and whenever you see it, you just want to expend as many heals as possible. It's a good idea usually for the player affected by it to use their big defensives immunities early, because as the dot keeps ticking, you'll have more and more time to ramp your hots for mastery, but it's usually the beginning of the dot where it gets most lethal. Well, this fight took a little longer than expected. It was it was 4.5 minutes. Usually, if you're doing this key on a Tyrannical setting, which I would recommend, you should probably, or I mean on a fortified setting, which I would recommend, it would take under 2.5 minutes, usually 3 minutes at most. So here, because it's Tyrannical, we do kind of a big pull. It can be hard to save time in workshop on Tyrannical because the dungeon is so linear, but this is one of the few situations where you can save a little bit of time by combining 2 pulls. It can get a little bit annoying, but you can see where I choose to position. I'm trying to position myself away from everyone else so that if the frontals are on me from the cars, no one else has to dodge them, because sometimes visibility can be really hard in this pull. So anytime that you can position yourself away, not only is it easier for your team because you're pointing some of the spells away from them, but it's also easier for you because it's easier for you to see when it's on you. Whereas when everyone's stacked up together, it can be hard to track. So this last pack is usually pretty easy as long as you don't have to pull any of the defense bots. The way these shields work is they actually stack additively. Each shield is 75% damage reduction, but if you stand in 2, you're basically invulnerable. So anytime that you see 2 together, you should probably just stand in them because you can't take damage. These mobs have a tank bleed that stacks called Chain Blade. You can see I'm tracking this on the tank frames. It lasts an absurdly long time and it does a lot of damage. It's not too bad on Tyrannical, but when you're pushing high fortified keys, you have to be wary of this debuff. You'll see that the debuff persists long after the fight's over. We're clearing these shields to stay out of combat, or to get out of combat, but the debuff is still on the tank. Sometimes in pugs, you'll find that the tank won't notice it because, well, they don't notice it, and they click on the obelisk and they go into here with stacks of the debuff. So you have to be careful about that. Don't just fall asleep right away because the pull is over and you're trying to get mana. This guy can be really annoying with growths. Sometimes I even choose to trank this on bursting, just because not only is everyone taking a lot of damage from the growths, but the bursting stacks are going off because everyone's trying to kill him, and most people aren't that aware of the combination of bursting and the growths. They're usually just killing them, and so they can tend to chain and extend really bad. You have to be careful here not to expend a lot of resources, it can be tempting to use Iron Bark and Bark Skin and stuff on the tank because he's taking heavy damage, but the way that we're doing this is we're doing the blob with the last boss, and so you want to have a lot of stuff available for the tank on pull. So it's a better idea to just be running this guy around and not expending any cooldowns, because it's a bad idea to not have cooldowns on pull. Especially at this point, you can look at the timer and you generally have a good idea of how long, if you can time it or not. The last boss takes about 5 minutes on a high key, so when you're sitting here with 8 or more minutes left, you know you're going to be fine as long as you live. So one thing that's really important here is baiting and positioning. It's really tough on the tank in terms of damage and moving around. So you want to make sure that you don't bait the blob pools or these orbs behind the tank. You want to try and keep them away from their path. The strategy that we use is I try and stand towards the middle, and then the tank goes around the room in a circle. It gets a little hard, but you don't want to grief the tank. For example, if I was standing behind him right there and that dropped that pool, it gets a lot harder and you risk depleting the key instantly, because the tank damage on with these two mobs is pretty high. On top of that, it makes it a little easier to spread out for the Giga Zap too when you're in a different spot. This can get a bit hectic when you have to run away from this guy, so I still try and pack as tightly as I can to the center, even if I can't get all the way in the center. I'm tracking the Giga Zap debuff on people. It does a very large amount of damage, so you want to make sure. You can see I stack a bunch of hots there. I had almost everything on our hunter there. Once the blob dies, this fight gets pretty easy. In general, it's just a matter of healing whoever gets Giga Zapped and making sure they're topped. There's not really too much more to go over about this part. I think in general phase 2 is harder, so if I have the option, usually I'd prefer Lust on phase 2. We have a little bit of an issue there. Let's skip ahead a little bit. So this is phase 2. One thing is, if you're low on mana, you can actually channel a replenishment potion right here when you get out of the stun. You don't always get the full 10 seconds, but you get very, very close. You get, let's say, 8.5 or 9 seconds out of it. So if you're at this point, you're realizing, oh shoot, I spent way too much mana, you can just channel a replenishment potion here. Keep in mind too that you do have other resources available. Even if it looks like my mana is lowish here, I have Innervate available soon, as well as my Mott Claw up. So I'm not too worried about mana. This is a boss where I generally want it to die as fast as possible, so even if it's pretty heavy damage, I'm just trying to kill it. You can see there that the orbs didn't seem to do that much damage. I get the impression that these orbs are also boosted by Fortified, counted as minions and not Tyrannical, so use that with what you wish, I guess. Generally, I think the best approach to handling these Giga Zaps is actually not to move. As soon as you see as soon as people see that big line, they're going to move out of it. So as the person with the big line, you don't want to be moving around. You just want to be planted, stationary. After the first set of Giga Zaps, he does the Magneto Arm. I get the impression that Magneto Arm is also boosted by Fortified because it doesn't seem to do much damage. In general, the most important thing here is that you just have a decent amount of hots up and protect yourself. Again, if someone gets caught by an orb or anything happens, you can always just use a B-res. But if you die, it becomes really, really tragic. So the next Giga Zap after that Magneto Arm doesn't have anything particularly dangerous associated after it. It's just the boss meleeing and these orbs moving around. So I try to use this time to just do a little bit damage, and I don't worry too much about keeping everyone topped. You can see the way I handle the beam every time is I bear form it, I bark if available, and I try and keep moving. That way if the orb goes to me, I'm gonna move out of it. So now after the second Giga Zap, you can see this Magneto Arm comes out again. About the Giga Zap is that it won't target you again if you have the debuff, but it can if you immune the debuff. So if you're really struggling, that's important. that's an important time for your team to use their immunities. So for example, if a mage ice blocks the first Giga Zap, it can actually continually target the mage. It won't happen every time, but it can, and that can be a way to relieve a lot of pressure if the rogue, for instance, cloaks 2 of them or the mage ice blocks 2 of them. That way you only have to deal with 1. But for the most part, that's it. That's Workshop 23. Hopefully you have a better understanding of the dungeon now that we walked through it. Thanks for watching. Give me some suggestions as what you'd like to see next. I think next on my list is probably, from gauging the comments, Toldagor Shrine. So thanks again for watching. Happy keying, friends.